I want to introduce Geena Rocero, who was born and raised in Manila, Philippines, and is a four-time Emmy nominated and award-winning producer, writer, director. She is a 2023 Glamour Woman of the Year, and that made her the first Filipina to receive the honor. Clap to that. And then Geena, you were also named Out 100's most impactful and influential LGBTQ people. You've become a leading voice in the fight for transgender equality, changing stereotypes, and advocating for policy changes and greater protections. And so I just want to thank you so much for spending time with ShareWell today. I mean, you speak around the globe, and having you speak here with us in this intimate setting is just a real treat. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. Hi, all. I love this intimate setting. It's, as much as I love being on stage, I love, I'm sure we'll get to it. I'm a pageant girl. I love my Q&A. I love engaging question and answers. So
I love it. Great. Well, we will dive right into that. So Geena, you actually came out on the TED stage, and your TED Talk, Why I Must Come Out, had widespread media attention and acclaim. I remember when it came out, and it was just taking over the internet. It was everywhere. And if you audience members haven't seen it yet, definitely watch it. It's incredible. And Geena, I would love for you to share with the audience what inspired you to take that courageous step so publicly.
yeah, no, thank you. That was actually 10 years ago now. That was in 2014. It came out in March 31st, in honor of Transgender Day of Visibility. And, looking back, I mean, yes, the title of the talk, Why I Must Come Out. I think it's a little bit more complicated, right? Because my background, growing up, being born and raised in the Philippines, I've been out and proud at such a young age in the Philippines. And, I've had a very public and visible career in transgender beauty pageants in the Philippines. But then when I moved to New York City in 2005, this is a very different time. Being an out and proud trans-identified fashion model was not allowed. So I made a conscious decision, a very difficult decision, but, at the time, I made that choice to go about my life and my career, that when I, moved to New York as a fashion model, I decided to be stealth. Not a lot of people knew about my trans identity, including my fashion agent, my modeling agent, and the industry did not know I was trans. So living that life and living that double life of having to manage different realities or stories I have to share, I have to edit everything. It really took its toll, and I did that for 8 years. And, on my 30th birthday, after living that life, that in as much as, I was living my career, this was the dream that I wanted, to be a fashion model. I was out there doing the thing, covers of magazine. And, I think this is why even, in this conversation that we're having right now, it was this managing this anguish of on one side, I was, a successful fashion model in covers of magazines doing the thing, but I was also, carrying this secret. And in a way, it really built up to this shame that I was feeling. And after years and years of doing that, I've had enough. I've had my own struggle in the way I looked at myself, my own self-esteem, and I've had enough. I got sick. I got let me just say, it got really dark at, in many points. That on my 30th birthday, I told myself that if I'm going to share this story, my truth, in a way, I wanted to, do it in the biggest stage as possible. And, as someone, with background being on stage, I was like, let me do it in the biggest stage, which is, at the TED conference. And little did I know in 2014, in hindsight, what a moment, because this was, I certainly did not know that 2014 became this, cultural zeitgeist in conversation on trans identity and pop culture. And, as someone born and raised in the Philippines, sort of I offered that very global perspective on, what it means to be trans.
Thank you, Geena. Yeah, so incredibly brave of you. And what you're right, what a moment, like in building up to it. I can only imagine like 8 years, that's a lot to have been so out in the Philippines and then restrict and close yourself back up.
Yeah. I
I'm
have to say, because it's also in the context of the culture, right? I mean,
yeah.
I was, I was told, my mom's side, my family has been here in America, and I was told, like, yes, I will have. I mean, one of the reasons why I moved to America is because I was able to change my name and gender marker on my legal documents. I will have an F on my ID. But little did I know, when I moved here, in a way, I've experienced the reverse. The sense of freedom that was promised. I remember feeling shamed about that identity that I was so proud of in the Philippines, because,
Mhm.
trans individuals are seen, as something to be ashamed of, especially at that time. The cultural conversations, what you see in media was all about, was all about, you know, trans as something to, be ashamed of. So I had to go through my own process of, let me go back to where I came from, the roots in the Philippines, the ancestral knowledge and resilience that's always been embedded in my ancestors. So I wanted to honor that, and that's why the big driving force why I came out.
Yeah, I love that. And yeah, do you, Geena, let's go a little deeper into your upbringing in the Philippines and how that shaped your activism to this day.
As I mentioned earlier, in the Philippines, trans people have always been part of society.
Mhm.
As someone, who's from a country and culture that's been colonized multiple times over, um, I had to dig deeper on the long history of trans identity in the Philippines. In pre-colonial Philippines, trans people are the
Mhm.
spiritual advisors to our, kings and queens, to our leaders. Even in our very culture, in our very language, we don't have he or she in our language. Our language is gender neutral. So even that, when I moved to America, when I would speak English, I would confused saying he or she, because we don't have binary language. And that's
Mhm.
not just in the Philippines, but it's also all around, the Pacific Islands. You know, uh, Colonialism has a big role in introducing binary
Mhm.
identities or way of thinking. So I have that as, in a way, a grounding force. But then also in the Philippines, we have this very vibrant mainstream culture of transgender beauty pageants. At 15 years
Mhm.
old, I started competing in trans beauty pageants. I became the pageant diva. And and I traveled all over the Philippines, made a lot of money. At some point I was making 10 times the national average wage in the Philippines. And but
Mhm.
also this very important context, like trans, I like to always say that trans people in the Philippines are culturally visible. We're
Mhm.
part of mainstream society. Our trans beauty pageants are shown on national television where everybody watches it. Yeah,
Mhm.
and our trans beauty pageants also, when we are, well, this is predominantly Catholic culture, so we have these fiesta celebrations that happens throughout the year. So it's usually like a 5-day celebration. And on the fifth day, on the main event, when we celebrate a Catholic saint and patron, the main event is a transgender beauty pageant that falls on a Sunday where the whole family is watching. So we're mainstream visible in the Philippines, but we're actually not politically recognized. There are no rights for trans people in the Philippines that recognizes our identity. I mean, to this day, I can't change my name and gender marker. There's no possibility for me to do that. So,
Oh, interesting.
carrying it sort of dichotomy. And then when I moved to America, it was the other way around, right? I was able to change my name and gender marker, but then the cultural acceptance and what I see in media was completely different. Where it's not as, especially at the time, in 2001 when I moved to America, it was a very different way how people see trans people.
Yeah, thank you for that, Geena. Very, very insightful. And I'm curious, in terms of the US, what do you believe are some of the most pressing issues facing the transgender community today, particularly in terms of mental health?
I'd say this. I work, a lot with trans youth. I'm an, I will always honor that very loving community that have loved me and accepted me at such a young age when I was in the Philippines. That kind of immediate communal bond, what it means, in our community. You know, Currently, I mean, we all know the political attacks, the social cultural conversation that's happening right now, and the dehumanization of trans and gender non-conforming folks, especially the youth, that just wants to be, who we are, and they just want to express who they are. But because, we are now the political target, it does affect, mental health, particularly in our youth. I mean, there are so many statistics that to back up the anxiety, the mental anguish that a young trans person, gender non-conforming folks are experiencing right now. That at the other side of that, as I have this conversation with them, it's more the reflection of society and how they see us. There is nothing wrong with us. We know our truth, right? We are expressing our truth in a world that we know at such a young age that doesn't want us to be who we truly are, that doesn't create a space for us to feel seen, to feel heard, to feel affirmed. We're still here. We're still claiming our space. We're still pursuing what is truthful for us. So certainly, it's a difficult time, because in a society that's supposed to, or in a political realm where we're supposed to be protected, everybody should feel welcome and protected. It is the very powerful people that's supposed to care for all citizens in the world are attacking already the most vulnerable in our community. So, in as much as the policy attacks that's happening right now, it's really that sense of belonging that a lot of trans and gender non-conforming, particularly youth, that are experiencing right now, that they're being attacked, their very identity.
Yeah. Yeah, Geena, thank you so much. I mean, you have your finger on the pulse in all of this, and changes are being made thanks to all of the activism that you're doing. So, thank you. Like, you are single-handedly changing the world along with all of the other people who are really rising up to call for change. And I'm curious, in terms of intersectionality and how you navigate and amplify voices of marginalized communities within the broader LGBT movement, what's your strategy? And also, like, how can some of us on this call get more involved?
I'd say this. I'm an artist. I'm a storyteller. I've been, I've had, a production company. I have a production company. I remember, and I remember how poignant this was when I had this realization. In 2014, when I gave that TED Talk and it went viral, I mean, because, at the time it was considered like this big shift in conversation. I remember being thrust into this sort of global conversation. And yes, I wanted to continue to share that conversation. And at the time, I launched an advocacy campaign advocating for this thing called gender recognition policy. I traveled around the world. I worked with the UN, President Obama's State Department and his team, and the different departments called, and I traveled around the world in relation to, in collaboration with them to speak about trans rights. I remember doing that for a couple of years, and I just got to a point where I felt like I've left a closet of not being out and proud as a trans person. And I would find myself to be the only one in the room, to be the only trans person, to be a only POC person, to be the only woman in most of, these powerful spaces. And I just felt like I've left, a closet. I felt like I've entered a new um, space of respectability politics. So I am a storyteller. I'm an artist. I told myself that in as much as I'm advocating for policy, I know there are also limits. So because I'm an artist, I want to keep telling story. And what better way to expand that conversation by telling stories, not just about my story, but how do I bring people with me, right? How, the door's been open. How do I keep that door open? And that's when I started a production company to tell stories from different perspectives, trans people in sports, in the employment journey, to the history of transgender in fashion, models in fashion that are trans identified, and the long history of it. And I think for me, I speak about my journey as a proud trans Filipina immigrant, that carries this very intersecting identities. And I think for me, as a storyteller, I like to always center the most marginalized in when it comes to point of views. Because if we do that, we automatically deconstruct all the intersecting layers of oppression. Because by centering those narratives, by centering those perspectives, we get to highlight and shine already, the most important aspect of what's needed, because the first attack that we get is like we're being dehumanized. But to give platforms to stories of not just myself, but the different people that I highlight in my productions, in my projects, right away, you present a very complicated person with complicated needs, with very nuanced point of view. And in a way, that's what's about. The first line of defense in this dehumanizing attack is to humanize ourselves in so many ways, in the most basic way, right? So I think that's what I'll say to that, is by centering those perspectives that we have in our.
I love that. Yeah, and Geena, we had another speaker just 2 days ago who she's all about storytelling for mental health. And one of her big kind of wisdom nuggets was that everyone has the story to tell. And when you tell your story, you heal others, even if it's just two people who read your story and have an impact. Was it worth it? Right. And so, Geena, you've told your story to the world now, and, helped and inspired countless people. And so, yeah, for those, in this room today, Geena's an example of how your story is so transformative. I really love that, Geena. Yeah, thank you. And speaking of stories, so you have a new memoir that has just come out, Horse Barbie. And
You
so do
mean
you want to
this?
share?
You mean this?
Yeah, yeah. Do you want to share a bit about that, and maybe a wisdom nugget or two for our audience? Get them
Yeah,
excited about it.
I have to say, I wrote this book during the pandemic, and it's one of those moments where I felt like it was my spiritual refuge in the moment in time where, the world is falling apart in so many ways, in so many aspects. Like, and then in this one, when I was writing this book, I felt like this is my chance to tell this global journey of finding myself, of finding, in pursuing my dreams. Um, and I got to do that. And I'm really excited to continue to share that. And I got to honor, the vibrant trans beauty pageant cultures that we have in the Philippines. But I think most importantly, you know, there's so many there's so many conversations that I wanted to share in the book, but I think the most important thing is really tell the story in the way I've lived my life, and this story is not about, I know I've lived a cinematic life, you can't be more cinematic than, living in this trans beauty pageants in Catholicism. And in a way, for so many years, in many conversations or in many platforms, there's this aspect of, we have to always dignify ourselves, where, I know media conversations are like that, but by telling my own story in a book format, I get to just be my full self. I talked about mental health. I talked about pleasure. I talked about decolonizing my mind. I talked about finding love. I talked about the things that makes me the full human being that I am, with all these needs, with all these wants, without having to sort of go through the process of like, look, accept me for who I am. I know I'm already a full person. So let me just tell you the story that I've lived.
Yeah, I love that, Geena. And I saw someone in the chat, can't wait to read it. I travel next week. Yeah,
Yay.
highly, highly recommend it. We'll also post it for the people who couldn't make it live on this talk. We'll also share it with them, Geena. And then I'm curious, you mentioned that you had your own personal struggle with mental health. And, at ShareWell, we come together in our struggles with mental health and find others that we can relate to, and we offer each other peer support. So I'm curious, Geena, like, can you share a little bit about a low moment that you went through and then how you pushed through it on the other side?
Let me see. Certainly, when I was modeling, in stealth, where, as I mentioned earlier, having to manage, the different realities and editing myself and having to hide a lot of who I am, obviously, doing my TED Talk, I was able to, sort of get over that, but I think the, the one that the most recent one where it was really, I was reminded that this journey continues, that there's not one aspect of, you got through it and maybe, you'll be stronger. We all go through those slow moments. I remember this was in 2019. I remember, having this incredible moment where I was named the first trans Asian Pacific Islander Playboy Playmate, where, a history-making moment where I was, celebrated all over the world, all, celebrating that aspect, right? And then I remember towards the end of that press tour, I was invited by ACLU to give a speech in front of the Supreme Court. It was at the time when the decision on, you know, uh, you know, the non-discrimination policy that it should support trans people in 2019. And I remember being in front of the Supreme Court, speaking about my story. And right next to us was like this barrage of anti-trans protesters that were so loud. And, I was able to give that speech. And I remember going home and I just went in a complete, mental anguish. It was almost, I felt like it was a whiplash of reality that changed in a second because, for a minute I was, being celebrated in this history making moment, announcement of Playboy, Playmate. And then next thing I knew, I'm in front of the Supreme Court asking the most basic rights that we should all deserve, right? To be able to not be discriminated at work because of who we are. And it's that kind of whiplash. I remember it got dark and weeks and weeks and weeks. I remember finding myself not being able to get up, and an incredible partner that was there with me, reminding me of what's good in the world, and to remind yourself to be grateful. And yes, I know that helped, but there is definitely in those moments when things got so dark, when you're just wanting that help, I think in those moments, I think this is why it's so incredible to find that person where we could truly express, that would accept us in our most vulnerable, moments. I distinctly remember how I knew that it's time for me to eat when that microwave ding was like there, because I know that's my food. And that's all, in a way, in those days and weeks, that's all I remember, that reminded me that I still have to go through this. And I think after weeks and weeks of doing that being in that low moment, I was reminded because what was coming up was like was a birthday trip for my mom, and it's been set up for many, many months. And I just felt like I have to be there for my mom. And I pushed myself to arrive at the place where we were supposed to be. But then once I got there, I was reminded what was really the most important, my family who
Mm-hmm.
loves me. Yes, they love all the achievements, but like I'm just their sibling. I'm just my mom's daughter. I was reminded of what was real and what was really keeping
Mm-hmm.
me grounded is because of the love and support of that what my family has been through with me. So it's my family that helped me got through it. I was reminded of what was the most important thing, what was real.
Yeah, I love that, Geena. We all have people in our corner. It sounds like it was family for you. And when you don't have people in your corner, that's why platforms like ShareWell exist, so you can find those people who will be in your corner. And I just thank you for sharing that. But I'm curious, Geena, if you could give one piece of advice to someone who is struggling with their mental health right now and feeling like they don't have anyone to talk to, what would your advice be?
I think I'd say this in my own journey, in my um in this moment, as an out and proud trans person who's so visible, I consider myself a spiritual warrior, where the journey of the ups and downs will always be there. What helps for me is knowing that, finding my own tools, right? And I think for me, the most important tool is the reminder that right away when things are, when I'm going through that moment when I'm in that mental anguish of how do I get to the next thing? Who do I call? Why is this happening to me? My tool for me is to always remind myself that I have to reach out. I had to find whoever that is, what platform that I could, trusted community that I could reach out to. Because in those moments, certainly I've had many moments of those struggle when I felt like I'm the only one going through this, to have that tool to remind myself that as I reach out, the big reminder is like, you're not the only one going through this, right?
Mhm.
The more you open about that vulnerable moment and that state of being that, wherever you are, it becomes that connection. And that's the first tool that I always have to remind myself is to reach out and to find that. And sometimes we get overwhelmed. Does it have to be a big community? Does it have to be, but sometimes we just need that one person, and
Mhm.
for me, I'm lucky to have friends that I could certainly, pick up that phone call. But there's one person that every time I call her, I'm reminded about where I came from in my journey. I always reach out to my transgender mother, Tiger Lily, who is living in the Philippines, and I've known since I was 15 years old. We're still in touch. Just a reminder of our journey together, and knowing that I could reach out and knowing that the tool in reminding myself that I'm not the only one, I have to reach out and just express this.
Thank you so much, Geena. Everyone send Geena some love. Thank you, Geena. I appreciate you.